Hey guys, it's James Corbett, corbettreport.com. Remember me? Hey, remember when I said that I wasn't going to be posting anything to the website in August? Well, I guess I fibbed. No, I am not. I know you're all jonesing for your Corbett fix, and you can't wait to hear my hot take on the latest news passing through the news wires, but that is not why I'm here today. No, I will be back in September, posting with the regular news and updates and New World Next Week and all that good stuff. For August, as you know, I'm taking a bit of a hiatus, working on some projects behind the scenes, but I thought, as a little special treat, it's the middle of August. I know what you're thinking about. Man, I wish I had a couple of hours of lecture on the history of mass media to keep me occupied during this Corbett hiatus. Well, here you are, guys. I am going to deliver for you today. So here's what we're going to do. I am going to play the first lesson of the Mass Media A History online course, which I hope you know by now is available through New World Next Week. It is a 3-lesson course, and in those 3 lessons, there's 5.5 hours of lecture. When you purchase the course through New World Next Week, you get not only the video downloads of those lessons, you also get the transcript of every single lesson, a hyperlink transcript, of course, so it has the links to all of the sources of everything that I'm talking about, as always. Also has study notes and course guide, as in questions for further study, recommended reading, etc. So there's a lot of information in that download. I really think it's worth your time and attention, but I could talk about it till I'm blue in the face. Why not show you at least part of it? So we're going to go through lesson 1 here, 2 hours of lecture on the history of mass media, essentially from the time of Gutenberg up till the 20th century. A lot of information in here, some of which probably will be familiar if you're familiar with the Media Matrix documentary. Obviously, that was based largely on the research that is embedded in this course, but this course goes, as you'll see, into much more detail and many more sources and quotations and things to dig your teeth into if you are so inclined. If you are like me, if you find this subject interesting, I guarantee you will find this course interesting. So let's watch lesson 1, and then at the end I'll come back and tell you about how you can continue with this course if you are so inclined. Enjoy. We are here in a course called Mass Media, A History. I am your host, James Corbett. It is November 2021, and we are in lesson 1, The Media Conspiracy. As always, I always want to start to share my sources and my notes and all of that. So there is going to be a link for this, corbettreport.com/massmedia. Don't go there yet. It hasn't been posted yet, but it will be shortly after we finish today. And it'll have all of the references to all of the specific things that I cite in this course and recommended reading as well. So as I said to the people who got here early, this is going to be a data dump of information. I'm going to try my best to get through it all, but we'll see how far we get today anyway. Get your pen and paper handy. All right, so let's start by talking about what the course is going to cover, right? Fair enough. So you might expect this is going to be names and dates and figures and places. This is a history course, right? Well, no, this is a philosophical exploration of the meaning of media. And I think this goes to the heart of what it is I do and why I do it. I'm very excited about this topic because I think this speaks powerfully to the relationship of technology to society. How does the technology that we are using, or is it using us, structure our society? We have the relationship of media to power, an extremely important subject that I think should be obvious to people who are regular listeners of the Corbett Report. Media often speaks to power, and if the last 2 years has taught us anything, I think it is that media can, of course, have an incredibly profound effect on shaping political discourse and political, at least preparing the public for various political moves. We're going to talk about the question, what is the news? And people might remember if they saw, I had a video up a couple of years ago about the news is a social construct. It is used to program you or something along those lines. This is one of those questions that I hope there are some people out there that go, like, what? That's a stupid question. What's the news? I don't know. I turn on the CNN, or I open the newspaper, or I go online and I get the news. What is the news? And where did that concept come from? How did it develop? What did it used to look like? What does it look like now? What will it look like in the future? And what do those differences mean? I think are incredibly important questions, actually. So I hope by the end of this course, you will look at that question and go, I don't know exactly, but it's probably an important question. And we're going to look at the past, present, and future of media. This is called Mass Media, a History. It should probably be called the past, present, and future of media, because we're going to look at obviously what's happening today, how that relates to what happened in the past, and what we can expect in the future. But as always, my message is always that the future is not written in the stars. We are writing the history books of tomorrow with our actions today. So we have a part to play in shaping the future of media and what it will mean. And I think that's a responsibility that we should take seriously, because it truly will, I think, affect the ultimate course of humanity itself, not to put too big an emphasis on it. So those are just sort of the big topics that I think we'll keep coming back to throughout this course. Obviously, we're going to cover a lot of specific information, a lot of other things besides, but those are some of the big themes and questions that I want to be returning to as we continue our exploration today. I should note parenthetically that I believe it was brought to my attention that on the sign-up page, after you signed up for the course, it was told you the recommended reading was The Public Opinion by Walter Williams. Of course, that's Walter Lippmann. I hope everyone was able to suss that out. But don't worry if you haven't read it or only read bits of it. It's not necessary for you to have read it. We will be going through it here in the course. And another one that would be handy, I think, if you at least gave a perusal of, would be Marshall McLuhan, Understanding Media. A pretty important book that we're going to be returning to at various points throughout this course. But let's keep going. This is an academic enterprise of sorts, I guess, right? So let's start by defining our terms. Always helps to define our terms. If we're going to talk about mass media, a history, what is mass media? That's the question, right? So you could start like a bad high school essay with a dictionary definition, with singular or plural concord, usually with the, as in the mass media, the main means of mass communication, such as television, radio, and newspapers considered collectively. All right. I mean, so far, so straightforward, so pretty plain and boring. All right. Got it. How about a more technical definition? Science Daily. The mass media are diversified media technologies that are intended to reach a large audience by mass communication. All right. Again, pretty straightforward, pretty uncontroversial. Well, why don't we get a little bit deeper into it? Maybe there's something a little bit more controversial, or at least thought-provoking, that we can say about what mass media actually is. We could get into the academic side of it. For example, we could turn to the Chicago School of Media Theory at the University of Chicago, which has an entire page up. This will be in the course notes, again, corbettreport.com/mass media. If you're interested in an academic discussion of the question of what is mass media, they get into it here. It starts by noting that the first recorded usages of mass media as a term was in 1923 in Advertising and Selling, a journal title, I believe. Here, mass media is loosely defined as representing the most economical way of getting the story over the new and wider market in the least time. The etymology of the concept is crucial in understanding mass media, as it is composed of two highly nuanced words. And if you want the academic treatment of it, you can go to that page at the Chicago School of Media Theory, and they have a lengthy discussion drilling down what does mass mean, and what does media mean, and what do they mean in relation, and all of that. So it's if you're inclined, you can certainly check that out. But let's get a little bit closer to the heart of it. We're going to take a look at a definition from A Free and Responsible Press, which was the title of the publication by the Hutchins Commission, which ran from 1942 to 1947, which we will be talking about a bit later. So I'll give you the background on that. But in their final report that they issued, they said that the modern press itself is a new phenomenon. Its typical unit is the great agency of mass communication. These agencies can facilitate thought and discussion. They can stifle it. They can advance the progress of civilization, or they can thwart it. They can debase and vulgarize mankind. They can endanger the peace of the world. They can do so accidentally in a fit of absence of mind. They can play up or down the news and its significance, foster and feed emotions, create complacent fictions and blind spots, misuse the great words and uphold empty slogans. Their scope and power are increasing every day as new instruments become available to them. These instruments can spread lies faster and farther than our forefathers dreamed when they enshrined the freedom of the press in the First Amendment to our Constitution. So getting towards something that I think gets at least at the significance literal definition. But let's take a look at one more definition. This one, the mass media serve as a system for communicating messages and symbols to the general populace. It is their function to amuse, entertain, and inform, and to inculcate individuals with the values, beliefs, and codes of behavior that will integrate them into the institutional structures of the larger society. In a world of concentrated wealth and major conflicts of class interest, to fulfill this role requires systematic propaganda. All right, so this is getting obviously towards a more, I don't know if I say partisan, but at any rate, a more interested view of mass media and its effect on the population and how it can and often is wielded or must necessarily be wielded. To fulfill this role requires systematic propaganda. That definition coming, of course, from Manufacturing Consent by Edward S. Herman and someone named Noam Chomsky. Yeah, I don't know that name. I wonder who that is. I wonder what else he's talked about recently. Oh my God! Oh no! Yes, no. I am not. As you might not know, I am not a fan of Noam Chomsky or his pronouncements. Certainly, his most recent pronouncements. More on which in my last edition of New World Next Week, in case you haven't seen that. But this is actually a valuable moment that to interject that in the pursuit of an academic enterprise like we are engaged in here, looking at the deep levels of these issues, we have to separate ideas from the people saying them. And just because I strongly disagree with Chomsky on many of his pronouncements, especially with regards to the current situation, it doesn't mean that Manufacturing Consent is not a valuable book with a lot of valuable information, verifiable information, as well as an interesting framework for viewing media. And that's one of the books that I think we'll be getting into in more detail next week. But let's move on. All right. So the next logical question to ask before we actually get into the meat and potatoes is, why does any of this matter? Why should we care about mass media or its history or its future even? And I hope that some of those definitions at least point the way towards why we should be interested in this. Again, if clearly people are being led through mediated experience, and I don't know about you, I don't know about, sorry, I jumped the gun there. I don't know about your personal experience. I'm not an average person, right? I am someone who works online for a living. I do this all day, every day. So I spend an enormous amount of my life in mediated experience, either listening to podcasts, watching videos, writing and corresponding with people via email, getting comments and messages, producing podcasts and videos. I spend so much of my time in front of the screen that I'm surely not the average person, whatever that means. But I would like you all to reflect in your own lives. How much of your life do you spend in mediated experience? Any sort of experience of the world, the greater world outside, that is not coming directly from people in the same physical room as you. I would venture to say that, well, obviously, given that you're engaging in this, obviously some of your time is spent in mediated experience. And if you really start to think about it, it may be even shocking how much of your life is spent through some sort of mediated experience rather than direct lived experience. What does that mean? How does that shape your understanding of the world and ultimately who you are as a person? And I think once you start to put some thought into it, the question of, well, where is that media coming from and who controls it and for what purposes? becomes an incredibly important question. So why does it matter? It matters because, as we will see throughout this course, media itself really is structuring our civilization around it. It is not some sort of neutral tool that we use to further our ends of communicating with others. It is in some ways a tool that is using us. And if we allow that to happen passively without putting any thought into it, we can be led along in some very bad directions. So let's think about that. But on a much more personal note, I want to share this with you. So this is a picture of the Newcastle Evening Chronicle from 19 ? I have no idea the actual year of this. I'm going to say mid-century-ish, but I don't know the precise year. But that person in the middle holding the clock is my great-grandfather. And so he was working in the Newcastle Evening Chronicle machine room, operating the printing press. And I don't know exactly what he did with regards to that, but that was my great-grandfather. And in fact, because I grew up in Canada, all of my extended family is in England, I never met my great-grandfather. I think I met my grandfather once when I was a baby, so I don't really remember him. I didn't have any sort of experience with this or even know of this story until much later. I think I was in my teens before I even knew that this was part of my family history. But there you go, some relation to the press. And that, of course, is my great-grandfather holding the clock that he got for all of his decades of work in the machine room. Thank you very much for your lifetime of service. And over here, that's my grandfather, who also worked in the machine room at the Newcastle Evening Chronicle. And I believe I have an uncle that ended up being a delivery driver for the paper. So there are a number of people in my immediate family who have that direct personal connection to the newspaper industry, which we will be talking about in this first lesson. And so I guess I should start by defining what terms we're looking at here today and how we're going to define them. Again, any sort of definition that you latch onto is going to be somewhat arbitrary. For mass media, I am looking at any sort of a large-scale reproduction of media that's largely available. We're going to be concentrating a lot on electronic media, but today we're going to be talking a lot about print media. So I think very broadly, lesson 1, we're going to be looking at print media. Lesson 2, we're going to be looking at radio and television. Lesson 3, we're going to be looking at online media. That's just a general sort of breakdown, but there's obviously some crossover that's going to happen. So we'll go on with the story. And we'll look at the ways that media shapes our lives. And I think I've given an indication of that, but let's look at some other viewpoints on this. For example, everyone's heard that famous Mark Twain quote, right? If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read the newspaper, you're misinformed. Well, actually, sadly, probably quite accurate, but Mark Twain, ? Like almost every other quote that you could instantly know off the top of your head, this one too is probably apocryphal. It's never been buttoned down exactly who said this. There's no indication that Mark Twain ever said it. If you're really interested, I'll throw a link in the course notes to a whole investigation of where this quotation comes from. But anyway, I think it's a pretty valuable observation. How about Michael Parenti, who I had to look up in preparation for this course? I'm at the point where I had to look up, I think I've interviewed him. Did I interview him? I had to search on my own site. Yes, I have interviewed Michael Parenti 11 years ago. Anyway, he wrote, "The media may not always be able to tell us what to think, but they are strikingly successful in telling us what to think about," which is an incredibly important thing. In fact, maybe the most important thing. If they can at least get us thinking about certain subjects and not thinking about others, that might be an even more pervasive and insidious form of control than simply telling people what to think. If you tell someone what to think, they may rebel against you. Well, I'm not going to think that. But if you tell them what to think about, whether they agree or disagree, they're going to be concentrating their energies in that direction. So I think that's a profound and insightful point to make. Let's go way back, centuries back. Thomas Jefferson. Nothing can now be delivered, which is seen in, can now be believed, which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle. Polluted vehicle is a great name for newspapers, or maybe news media generally. Anyway, that's not all Jefferson had to say about newspapers. He said the basis of our governments being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter, i.e. newspapers without a government. But I should mean that every man should receive those papers and be capable of reading them, which is an interesting point to make. Of course, if you're talking about, well, rather than government, why don't we just have people who are talking about the issues and putting them out there in the form of newspapers? But everybody has to have access to those newspapers, right? Everybody has to be able to read them. Everybody has to be a part of that conversation for that to work, right? Which actually brings up a key sort of dilemma that comes up with media criticism that will continue to come up, as we will see later on in today's lesson, that continues to come up through the centuries. The idea of the negative liberty, that freedom of speech, freedom of the press is about the government not touching and interfering in the functioning of the press, versus the positive liberty that somehow the government is required or obligated to make sure that you do have access to the press and that you can. And do they have a positive obligation to do something, to interfere, to make information widely known? And I think Jefferson is pointing to that in that quote, that it doesn't work simply if you just let it go. Every man should receive those papers and be capable of reading them. So there's some sort of hint towards the idea of positive liberty being forwarded there. A lot more to tease out. We'll get into that later. Let's look. Skipped ahead. Let's look at Soichi Oya, a Japanese media critic who noted that the most evolved mass media, radio and television, this quote comes from decades ago, can be said to be deploying a campaign to transform Japan's entire 100 million into imbeciles, which not just Japan, Soichi, probably not just Japan. Let's get into an interesting story from The Black Banners, which is a book by Ali Soufan, who you may not know about, but you will when I release part 2 of my Al-Qaeda documentary. Long story short, he was an FBI investigator who was investigating the embassy bombings and the Cole bombing. In his book, The Black Banners, he has this fascinating little story that I wanted to read to you. When the radio was first introduced in Saudi Arabia, conservative Wahhabi clerics denounced it as the devil hiding in a box. Wahhabism traditionally is suspicious of new technology, viewing modernity as an evil that takes people further away from the ideal way of life as practiced by the Prophet. The clerics demanded that King Abdul Aziz, Saudi Arabia's founder and ruler, ban the radio and behead the Westerners who had brought it into the country. The king relied on the clerics for domestic support and couldn't just dismiss their demands. If what you say is true, he told them, then we must ban the devil's work, and we will behead those behind it. You are a great and wise king, the clerics responded, excited that he was siding with them. And so, the king said, we will hold a public trial tomorrow about this devil box, and it will be brought before me. The king then secretly told the engineers working on the radio to make sure that the Quran was playing at the time of the trial. The next day, with the clerics present, the king ordered the radio to be brought before him. Turn this box on, he ordered. And as it was switched on, passages from the Quran were heard. The king, pretending to be confused, turned to the clerics and asked, can it be that the devil is saying the Quran? Or is it perhaps true that this is not an evil box? The clerics conceded that they had been mistaken, and there was no more labeling of the radio as the devil's box. So that's a fascinating story for so many different reasons. One of which, because I think it directly impinges on what we were talking about earlier, that the nexus of media and political power. And I think the king, obviously recognizing the potential power of such a tool of mass communication to more effectively wield over his subjects, thought, well, let's not get rid of this devil box quite so quickly. I think this might be to our advantage, so I'll make sure the clerics go along with it. Also, I think this story speaks to our position reading this story, it's difficult, I imagine, for anyone who is involved in this class to even put themselves in the position of being so afraid of radio technology. I'm hearing a voice that's coming from somewhere else. What's going on? It must be the devil. I think our tendency from our enlightened rational 21st century progressive perspective is, oh, that's just silly, old superstition. But I think it behooves us to keep in mind that people for centuries, well, for the entirety of human history until the last century or two, would have looked at any form of electromagnetic conveyance of voices and or images from far away as devilry. This is magic. This is crazy. I can't even understand what's going on. We laugh at the old-timey people who were afraid the camera was going to steal their soul. But it actually speaks to how thoroughly we have been steeped in media all our lives that we don't even question it anymore. And now our children are growing up with smartphones and whatever, and all of this is just second nature to them. Maybe we should try to step outside from that perspective and think from the perspective of all of our forefathers and foremothers and everyone who went before, who would have been absolutely at least amazed, if not scared, at the extent to which we're listening to voices and seeing pictures from far away. And what does that mean? How does that shape our entire worldview? All right. Anyway, those are, I think, some indications of how important media can be in shaping our lives. But, well, sometimes it gets very serious. So you may or may not know, but this was the LA Times building in 1910. Specifically, I believe in October of 1910, October 1st of 1910, there was a massive bomb that destroyed the LA Times building in Los Angeles, obviously. 21 people died. Many were injured. It was blamed on the Bridge and Structural Iron Workers Union because the publisher of the LA Times at that time, Harrison Otis, was a virulent opponent to unions. So he immediately thought, oh, this must be the work of the unions. And so they blamed it on the Bridge and Structural Iron Workers Union. Otis personally hired some private investigators to go out and find who did the bombings, and they forced a confession out of someone and found some suspects in Indiana that they then did a citizen's arrest, a private personal arrest, and illegally extradited them to California so that they could go to trial. It was a crazy trial involving Clarence Darrow and bribes and chicanery and all sorts of things. Eventually, it ended up in a mistrial, blah, 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 the wheels of justice, etc., grind as usual. But the long story short is, at any rate, someone really, really wanted to send a message to the LA Times because obviously media is extremely important. And the people who control that media have such a control over our lives that sometimes people feel that their only way to get their message out is mass violence. If you think that is only an old-timey thing, you might want to cast your mind back to 2018, where we had the YouTube mass shooting incident, which you may or may not remember. It got a little bit of attention at the time. There was a 38-year-old named Nassim Najafi Agdam who was upset about shadow banning. In fact, shadow banning of her channel. She wrote about it at the time. What was she saying? YouTube filtered my channels to keep them from getting views. And there is no free speech in real world, and you will be suppressed for telling the truth that is not supported by the system. Videos of targeted users are filtered and merely relegated so that people can hardly see their videos. And she responded to this by taking some loaded weapons into the YouTube headquarters in San Bruno and opening fire, killing 3 people and then killing herself. So, like the LA Times bombing, in the modern day and age, who cares about the LA Times? YouTube is where it's at, right? So these are the types of passions that media can incite in people, and for reasons that I think should be obvious to everyone involved in this. So the question then, I guess, is how did we get here? How did we get to this spot where, again, we live in this incredibly, almost pervasively mediated environment where I would say, most of the information we get is mediated, coming at us from a distance from third parties that we may or may not even know the names of. How did we get to this spot? And the answer lies, about 600 years back, specifically in Johannes Gutenberg. The Gutenberg conspiracy, which this is an interesting little tale. So people who don't know, of course, this is Johannes Gutenberg, the inventor of the printing press, essentially. Now, there's a lot of things to be said about that, but let's just get some biographical details. Johannes Gutenberg, born circa 1400, died in 1468. He was the son of a goldsmith in Mainz, Germany. He was producing coinage. His father was producing coinage as a companion of the mint. And so from his father, Johannes learned about metalworking. He became a skilled craftsman and an entrepreneur in the rising entrepreneurial class that was just coming up in late medieval Germany there. So Gutenberg was looking around for a good scam or scheme to get involved in. Well, not scam, but at any rate, something that he could apply his skills towards and hopefully make a buck or two. And he decided to target the pilgrimage to Aachen, which is something that happens every 7 years. It's been happening since 1349. The Aachen Cathedral displays 4 holy relics that they hold in their treasury. St. Mary's robe from the night that Jesus was born, Christ's swaddling clothes, the cloth in which John the Baptist's head was kept after his beheading, and Jesus' loincloth, which he wore on the cross. These are the 4 relics that are displayed every 7 years by the Aachen Cathedral to this very day. Anyway, supposedly they were given to Charlemagne centuries ago, several centuries ago, from Jerusalem. But anyway, the Aachen Cathedral displays these once every 7 years. People come from far and wide to see them. It's a big pilgrimage, and it was equally as big back in Gutenberg's day. Now, here's the thing. People believed at the time that if you held a curved mirror up to the holy relics, that the curved mirror would catch and contain the holiness of the relics or whatever holy power they're emanating. And so you could actually sort of collect the relic power for your own if you had a curved mirror. So Gutenberg thought, there we go. I'll make curved mirrors, because making mirrors was hard enough in the 15th century. Making curved mirrors was an exceptionally difficult task, but one that he, as a skilled craftsman with some metalworking experience, he thought, I can probably do this. So he unfortunately did not have the capital in order to do it all by himself. So he enlisted 3 business partners in his venture, and they got to work preparing for the 1439 pilgrimage to Aachen, starting the process of making these curved mirrors. And they were sorting out all the technical difficulties that came with trying to make these mirrors. And they were making some progress. And then guess what happened? The pilgrimage of 1439 was canceled due to the plague. And this is not the first time that the plague will pop up in our story today. But okay, so all that work goes to nothing. All right, so we've spent all this time and the thing's canceled. Incidentally, parenthetically, I'll put a link in the course notes about this. The Aachen, according to what it's saying, the Aachen pilgrimage last happened in 2014. It was due to take place in 2021, but it has been postponed due to the plague. So they're apparently going to have it in 2023. Get your calendar ready. I wonder what Gutenberg's plans just got dashed by that cancellation. But anyway, 1439, the Aachen pilgrimage gets canceled. Gutenberg still has his shop. He still has his tools. He still has ideas in his head, and he still has his business partners. So they decide to launch into a new venture. And this new venture will ultimately result in the printing press. But the development of this press was so important, so elaborate, so intricate, involved so many different problems that needed to be solved. Here's the thing. A lot of people poo-poo the printing Gutenberg press by saying, all of the various pieces of the press already existed. He just kind of threw them together. And that is not the case. And if you start to read about the development of the press and how much work had to go into it and how much incredible trial and error of various materials and things in order to find the right things that would work, it was a lot of work. And so Gutenberg and his 3 partners entered into a secret arrangement for the development of this, in which they conspired together. They vowed not to share the secret of their art with anyone. Specifically, Gutenberg's concept was so bold and the process to accomplish it so revolutionary that in 1438, he and 3 others entered into a contract that swore each of them to secrecy. What they called the secret art was so special that the contract further provided that should one of the partners die, his heirs would have no access to the secrets. Within a year, the plague had claimed one of the partners. As the partners had feared, the deceased siblings tried to force their way into knowledge, into the conspiracy, into knowledge about and an ownership share of the secret art. As part of this effort, they filed suit. A trial was conducted to determine whether the brothers of the dead partner could claim his share. The records of the trial forged the link between Gutenberg and the discovery of the movable type printing press. The records also display the extent to which Gutenberg went to protect the results of his work. Again, an exceptionally intricate process. Now, this comes from Gutenberg to Google by Tom Wheeler. And if the name Tom Wheeler means anything to you, then ding, 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 you're paying attention. I have mentioned him before. He was the telecommunications lobbyist who Obama, in his infinite wisdom, appointed as the head of the FAA. FAA, right? Okay. Anyway, the Federal Telecommunications, whatever, blah, blah, blah. You know, that FTA? No, I don't know. I'm suddenly blanking on that. But anyway, that Tom Wheeler. However, having said that, and I would not want anyone to put any money into the pockets of Tom Wheeler. But having said that, from Gutenberg to Google, certainly with regards to the early history about Gutenberg and some of the later things that he writes about, is actually extremely informative. And I hesitate to recommend it because, again, it's Tom Wheeler. But again, we're separating the person from the information. And that book has a lot of interesting information, like about the Gutenberg conspiracy. And if you do go and read that book, you will find more details about what I'm talking about with regards to the incredibly elaborate process that was required to bring the printing press to fruition. Not only the foresight to look at the page, the printed page, and understand it not as a singular thing that would have to be reproduced in its entirety, but as a collection of tiny pieces of information that could be assembled and reassembled in any configuration in order to create new pages. Again, that seems so basic to us now because we understand how a printing press works. Before the development of a movable type printing press, even that conceiving of that was a leap forward, particularly interesting one, as we will see as we start to explore some different sources, theorizing and philosophizing about that. But beyond that, the technical details of this, the need to standardize the process for creating the same size letters for the type was itself a big deal in the 15th century. Obviously, no machine tools that like we know today that could standardize and make everything the same width and the same size and everything. I mean, that in and of itself was a huge process and hurdle that had to be overcome by painstaking trial and error. There was the finding the right material for the paper, not only the availability and making it cost efficient, but also the consistency of the paper, the moisture of the paper, and how long the paper could last before it started to degrade, and all of those kinds of things had to be kept in mind. And then finding the right formula for the ink. You had to balance the viscosity of the ink with the stickiness to make sure that it would stick on the type itself. A huge, elaborate process. If you are interested in actually seeing a Gutenberg press and how it works, well, we don't really know because there is no surviving example of Gutenberg's original press. I think the earliest is one from 100 or 150 years after Gutenberg. So we don't know exactly what Gutenberg's press looked like, but we have a pretty good idea of the process and what was involved. And there's, I can't remember which museum of printing or something, I think in California, that has online, unfortunately on YouTube, but anyway, it has a demonstration video of how the press worked and how they had to roll the ink onto the beaters and how they beat them onto the type and then how they, it's a fascinating process. And to think that, Gutenberg essentially, and his partners, but his partners were more business partners, could have solved all of those various problems to come together to make the movable type printing press. It truly was a feat of engineering. Don't listen to people who simply poo-poo it as, oh, he just threw together a bunch of things that already existed. I think there was a lot of art and skill that went into it. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So Gutenberg himself produced 180 of the Gutenberg Bible, which of course was the thing that he went into printing, and he made as the first attempt to sort of monetize his idea. And it's a fascinating process, even the printing of the Bible. Each new chapter or each new book of the Bible had a space left in the page. That then the idea was you take each page and you bring it to your local monastery, cathedral, whatever, I'm not sure. And the monks, the scribes, would then fill it in with the appropriate artwork and letters and what have you. It's an interesting process. Again, it goes through that in that demonstration video, which I will include in the course notes, corbettreport.com/massmedia. But he made 180 of those Bibles, which doesn't sound like a lot, right? But thinking in terms of the time, I mean, how long would it take to copy out the Bible by hand 180 times? Start now and let me know when you finish, if you finish. Obviously, it was a big advance in the ability to disseminate information. It was the first true mass communication technology. Smoke signals, do you think they would count? No, I think this is the first real mass communication technology, at least for our purposes today. And to put that into perspective, it is estimated that during the entirety of Gutenberg's life, the first 50 years of the 15th century, from 1400 to 1450, all of the scribes in all of Europe produced by hand, obviously, writing out manuscripts, about 20,000 copies of texts. Do you want to venture to guess how many books were produced in the 50 years after Gutenberg, from 1450 to 1500? So the first 50 years of the 15th century, 20,000 books produced in all of Europe. The last 50 years after the invention of the movable type printing press, 12 million. 12 million books were produced in the latter half of the 15th century. That is a revolution. That is what revolution looks like. So let's stop to consider the magnitude of this, because I remember back around the 2000, 2001, whenever it was, there was some sort of special on, I don't know, A&E, CNN, TBS, I don't know, some cable channel that was looking at the most important inventions of the last 1,000 years, because it's the new millennium. So let's look the previous millennium, the most important inventions. And I remember watching that and getting towards the top 10 and everything and looking at these incredibly important things, the airplane and what have you, and thinking to myself, number one really ought to be something truly spectacular, something really amazing, something that truly transformed society as we know it. And number one, of course, was the Gutenberg printing press. And I thought, you know what? Actually, I'll go along with that. That probably was the most important invention of the past 1,000 years. Think about all of the things that the Gutenberg press did. What was the printing press revolution? Obviously, just as the first order, the sort of most obvious, it gave rise to widespread literacy. Obviously, I mean, there was literacy to some extent in pre-Gutenberg times, but who needed to be really literate pre-Gutenberg? Obviously, you have the monks and the scribes and the scholars and people involved with the court and what have you, who obviously needed written material and to work in that medium. But not the average person wouldn't have dealt with it very much. But now suddenly you're producing 12 million books in 50 years. Now you have widespread access and availability to text. You're going to need more people to read it. Suddenly the idea of learning to read becomes, well, pretty useful. Actually, I liken it in our lifetime. I remember my dad certainly thinking, learn to type? Why am I ever going to need to do that? And I'm not sure to this day, I think he still hunts and pecks with one finger each. But yeah, as ridiculous as the idea of learning to type was 50, 100 years ago, why would I do so? Now everyone learns to type, right? In the same way, who needs to read a book? Now suddenly people are reading the books. But that's just the first order of change that begins to happen. Of course, this ultimately impacts what kinds of books are being read. Because pre-Gutenberg, as I say, if it takes all the scholars in all of Europe 50 years to copy out 20,000 books by hand, you better believe they are going to be copying out the most important books. It's not going to be, Joe Schmo's random diary or something. This is going to be important books. So to get a taste of that, it's been estimated that pre-1700, more than 50% of the books that were in circulation in Europe were ancient or medieval. As in the time-tested, obviously, we want to keep writing Plato and Aristotle and the Bible and the greats, the works of the great, medieval scholars and what have you. But, the idea of novel writing, I mean, why? I mean, you really think you're going to compare to Aristotle or something? Come on. No, but now that it's relatively easy to produce many books, well, okay, all right. So Joe Schmo has something he wants to contribute. All right, let's do it. I mean, it's no coincidence that the novel as a form starts to arise in the wake of this revolution. And of course, everything else that goes along with it, including pamphlets and eventually newspapers and things of that sort, which we'll get into that aspect of the revolution. What else was important? Of course, the Reformation. Would Martin Luther and the 95 Theses and all of that, would it have really proceeded in the way it did without the printing press, which, of course, as we saw, was immediately used to start printing Bibles in the vulgar tongue of all things and putting not only access to this information, but access to the means to communicate to others widely available. It started to transform society in ways that could probably hardly have been conceived of when Gutenberg was actually working on the invention itself. How about the rise of nation states? This is where it starts to get more philosophical and abstract, but exceptionally important. So I want to turn to a little bit of Marshall McLuhan, who writes about these types of things in Understanding Media. For example, he says, in the Renaissance, he says, nationalism itself came as an intense new visual image of group destiny and status, and depended on a speed of information movement unknown before printing. Today, nationalism as an image still depends on the press, but has all the electric media against it. In business, as in politics, the effect of even jet plane speeds is to render the older national groupings of social organization quite unworkable. An important point that I think we'll be returning to in maybe lesson 3. In the Renaissance, it was the speed of print and the ensuing market and commercial developments that made nationalism, which is continuity and competition in homogeneous space, as natural as it was new. By the same token, the heterogeneities and non-competitive discontinuities of medieval guilds and family organization had become a great nuisance, as speed up of information by print called for more fragmentation and uniformity of function. So McLuhan starts to ponder and theorize about the rise of nationalism and the nation state being predicated on the printing press revolution, but it gets even better from there. The desacralization of nature. So, for example, he also writes, print then challenged the corporate... let's start a little bit back. Print then challenged the corporate patterns of medieval organization as much as electricity now challenges our fragmented individualism. The uniformity and repeatability of print permeated the Renaissance with the idea of time and space as continuous measurable quantities. The immediate effect of this idea was to desacralize the world of nature and the world of power alike. I don't know about you, but I'm just electrified by McLuhan's ideas. I think there's something profoundly important about what he's saying there, that yes, even that idea, which I was talking about earlier, conceiving the page as not a page altogether, but as little individual pieces of information that can be reorganized into any configuration, you start to think of the universe in those terms, and you start to get the rise of the idea that what becomes, I think, the scientific method, the idea that there's order to nature, and it consists of discrete parts that can be pulled apart and looked at and reconfigured, and we can start to engineer the world. It's not some sacred thing that exists and has always existed. It's something that we can start to engineer. I think there is something to this. The idea of even the printing press starts to give rise to that. So, it gets pretty philosophical. But where do we take this? The question that's before us in this course, what is the news? And this is a question we're going to keep asking over and over at different times. Let's start in 1601, where we had what is referred to as the first newspaper. That is a highly contentious thing to say. I've read dozens of sources on this, and almost everyone cites a different first newspaper, but according to Wikipedia, which is never wrong, the World Association of Newspapers, which apparently there is a thing called the World Association of Newspapers, has said that this newspaper was the first newspaper. It's called the, oh man, I am not going to butcher the German tongue with this. I'll just call it the Strasbourg Relation. The longer title, a Relation aller Vernehmen und Genderwirkungen Historien, I don't know, which apparently translates into account of all distinguished and commemorable stories, which is interesting, isn't it? Yeah, this idea of the news. We have to think there, to a large extent, our conception of what the news is stems from this printing press revolution. Pre-printing press revolution, what is the news? I guess you've got a town crier that'll go through, or you have proclamations from the king that'll occasionally be read out or something along those lines. But the idea of a daily, weekly, monthly, periodically published compendium of stories about what is happening in your area, and even that concept would not have existed certainly pre-literate society, and to a large extent pre-printing press society. That wouldn't have been really feasible. It starts to become feasible, and I think I don't know if it's just historical coincidence or maybe there's something to it. Gutenberg was developing the printing press in Strasbourg. The first newspaper arises in Strasbourg 150 or so years later. I think there would be a fascinating study to be written. I'm sure it has been written, but I'll just say there's a fascinating study that would be able to trace the geographical roots of the printing press and the effects it had in different places. And then considering the political crackdown that occurred in various places on the printing press and how the crackdown or lack thereof resulted in things like the development of the newspaper. There's a fascinating study to be written there if there's anyone out there looking for their master's degree in media studies or something. But let's go on. This is available online. You can actually read even the first ever edition online. I'll put the link obviously in the course notes if you want to, but my Middle Ages German is a bit rusty. So let's turn to the first English newspaper. ? The first English newspaper, the London Gazette. Well, actually, it started off as the Oxford Gazette, but the Gazette is sometimes called the first English newspaper by some sources, although, again, this is highly disputed, at least partially because the question is this even a newspaper? But just to set the table, in 1665, King Charles II relocated his court to Oxford to escape the Great Plague. Here it comes again. Plague is important in massive upheaval, isn't it? In the capital, London, exiled courtiers were so terrified of the disease that they were unwilling to even touch London newspapers for fear of contagion, which would imply that there was already newspapers, wouldn't it? So how is this the first thing? I don't know. Anyway, for this reason, the Oxford Gazette was first published on the 7th of November, 1665, and that is sometimes commonly referred to as the first English newspaper ? It is it has a claim to be the oldest continuously published newspaper in the English language. But the question really is it a newspaper? It certainly isn't a newspaper in the way that we would think of a newspaper, where you're going to have stories about foreign events and domestic politics and sports and weather or whatever. This is specifically, as that says, it's published by royal assent, but published by authority, as it says on the 1705 edition. And it is specifically for official notices of various kinds, granting of royal assent to bills, issuance of writs, appointments to certain public offices, commissions in the armed forces. This is essentially an official paper of record, a register, as it were. So the question really is this a newspaper? I'm not exactly sure, but it certainly has been forwarded as that. But then again, that relies on that question. What is the news? Is this the news? Well, I guess all of these things individually could be seen as news. Sure. There's a new appointment or there's royal assent to a bill. That's something, it's newsworthy. It's something you might see even in a regular newspaper. They might make a story about it. But this is all it is sort of a publication of official notices. So again, conception of what is news is not necessarily set in stone and is not written in the heavens, and it was developed over a long period of time. So this may or may not be the first one. Let's go to the About page, the history page from the Oxford/London Gazette, the Gazette's website, which again will be in the course notes, corbettreport.com/mass media. During the 17th century, potentially reckless publishing of articles, often just scurrilous rumors issued in pamphlet form, was thought to endanger national security, and this led to a climate in which the printing of any news not pertaining to the coverage of events abroad, natural disasters, official royal declarations, and the most sensationalist of crime reporting was largely prohibited. As a consequence, the British press was an ill-developed and badly defined industry. Oh, we can't have that, can we? The introduction of censorship in 1663, together with the licensing of all news publications, did little to encourage the growth of a healthy press. Do you think? Yeah. However, the situation was to change dramatically in 1665 with the worst outbreak of plague in England since the Black Death of 1348. The Great Plague is thought to have killed 15% of the population in London, and it forced King Charles II to remove his court from the capital and relocate, what was effectively the government of the day, to the relative safety of Oxford. It's said that the exiled courtiers were so terrified of the disease, they were unwilling to even touch London newspapers for fear of contagion. Again, I will insert, doesn't that mean that there were already newspapers? Anyway, the Oxford Gazette emerged from this turmoil, and when the plague finally dissipated and the court returned to London, the London Gazette was born. As the first official journal of record and the newspaper of the Crown, the Gazette became an authoritative and reliable source of news, and this served the purposes of both the Crown and the executive well, which is, of course, important. We want to serve all of the people who claim to be ruling over us, right? And as long as they're happy, then we're good. An authoritative source of news. So I think a lot of the same questions and problems that we face to this very day with the question when it comes up of the media is obviously here represented in something like the Gazette, the Oxford/London Gazette. So to put this in its context, that's the official history page, the real history of what was going on in this time. From 1641 to 1643, there was an explosion in printing in England. And that led to an explosion in, for example, new churches, some of which persist to this very day, the Quakers, the Baptists, some of which have been lost to the grains of time. The Familists, and I swear I'm not making this up, the Muggletonians. I don't know. Many, many different denominations and churches were popping up because they're all printing these tracts and they're all talking to each other, and all this literature is going around and expounding and carrying on the Reformation, essentially. So this started to worry people in power. People in church power, people in royal power. I think people are a little bit too using this press a little bit too freely. We have to do something about that. That led to the Licensing Act of 1643, which meant that a book had to be sent to the licensing agent, appointed by the Crown, obviously, for approval before publishing. Actually, I believe that was a parliamentary act. The Parliament particularly wanted to make sure they had the power because the Royal Star Chambers had been abolished a few years before, but Parliament was just like, no, we need that power for ourselves. We want this. We want the censorship. So they were essentially licensing all printers. Now, this led direct response the next year, 1644, the next year after the Licensing Act, to John Milton writing the Areopagitica, which, if you don't know, is hailed as the landmark in English language defense of free speech, the founding text of this entire field of thought, at least in the English language, about freedom of speech, freedom of the press. It's hailed as one of the forerunners to the idea of the First Amendment, etc. So a pretty important text, has some beautiful language in it. Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature, God's image. But he who destroys a good book kills reason itself, kills the image of God, as it were, in the eye. A pretty important text. So that led to that. And sadly, although Milton did his best, it wasn't for another 50 years that the Licensing Act of 1643 was finally allowed to lapse. And there was again a flourishing of printing in England. But I will note parenthetically that one of the things when you go to the About the History page of the Gazette, that's in the course notes, you will see that they note when the newly launched Times newspaper halted its presses to carry the report of Wellington's 1815 victory over Napoleon at Waterloo, it was merely to reproduce in full the dispatch which had already been previously published as a Gazette Extraordinary. So, and you can go and they have the link to actually look at the precise issue of the Gazette with the announcement, we kicked Napoleon's butt, yay. Well, actually, that brings us into a different part of this story. So now, with the printing press revolution, it's on. We now have mass communication, but it is mass communication via a physical medium that then has to be transported around. So obviously, this has greatly increased information supply and availability, but still, there's physical limitations on it. How fast can your horse go? And where can it go? And, do you have the network set up to keep information traveling around the continent, etc.? It's crude by today's standards, but obviously wherever there's a problem or a challenge or a difficulty, there are unscrupulous people who are going to make the most of that. And of course, if we're talking about Waterloo and the news of Waterloo and who won the battle, well, if you happen to know, say 24 hours before the rest of England knows who won the Battle of Waterloo, you could make a lot of money on that, couldn't you? Now, this, of course, is the famous story of Nathan Rothschild having an extensive network through his brothers, through the family, an extensive network of couriers and things that allowed him to get news of the battle before anyone else. Now, there are various permutations of this story that go around, and I am not going to presume to come to any definitive judgment on which is correct today, but I will point you to some sources. I'll put them in the course notes. The official story, you can get the official story from the Rothschild archives itself, which essentially admit that, yes, Rothschild did receive information before it was widely known, but poo-poos a lot of the other aspects of the story. So I'll throw in an article from the Telegraph from 2015 that went to debunk the story of Nathan Rothschild receiving this information. And they pinpoint a lot of it to a pamphlet that was published in the mid-19th century by Satan, who was under the pseudonym Satan, was talking about the rise of the Rothschild family and had this story in it. And in that version of the story, Nathan Rothschild himself was at the Battle of Waterloo and witnessed the events and saw the victory, and then was shuttled by his courier network home, getting to the English Channel. And then there was a big storm, so no boats were going. And so he had to bribe some ferrymen to ferry him across the channel, and so he could get back and start trading for his profit. That's a pretty outlandish story. By all accounts, Rothschild was not physically in France, was not at Waterloo. France? Belgium? Oh, man. Oh, I'm so geographically not inclined. All right. Anyway, he was not at Waterloo. So then the story also has it that there was, again, the message was sent from the battlefield to Rothschild via horses, couriers, homing pigeons, all sorts of things have been talked about. I talked about this in the Questions for Corbett a long time ago. So again, that'll be in the course notes if you're interested in that. But actually, in preparation for this course, I saw a source that I hadn't seen before, Frederick Morton, who a National Book Award winner and a New York Times journalist, and I don't know, definitely has the credentials that should be taken seriously, wrote what is, by all accounts, I haven't read it in its entirety, but anyway, by all accounts, a fawning history of the Rothschild family. But even he actually has an account of this story. Anyway, as I say, even the Rothschild archive admits to some degree that this actually happened, that Rothschild did receive information beforehand, but he used it for generous purposes and not at all to profit from blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I think the point of this story, again, whatever the truth of the story is, the point of the story is that information is power, but in an age where information is available, mass communication is available, but it has to be physically transported, then having physical infrastructure in place to transport that information is extremely important, isn't it? And that's why a lot of the history of, say, the 19th century, the American 19th century, is about the development of the railroad and how that transformed the geography of the United States in many ways. Towns that were extremely important as being port towns were suddenly being bypassed by the railway and suddenly become, secondary thoughts. Chicago became the second city because St. Louis was more reliant on shipping, and Chicago opened itself up to the railways, etc. So the idea of the transportation routes being an incredibly important part of the dissemination of this information becomes more and more important as the printing press revolution continues to play out in the preceding centuries. Until, could you imagine, what if we don't need a physical medium in order to transport information from one place to another? And that, my friends, is the next revolution, the telegraphy revolution. So, basically, long story short, for anyone who's interested, the telegraph essentially is a circuit being opened or closed at one end that produces an action at the other end. And that general idea had been around since at least 1753, when it was first proposed in a scientific journal. It was demonstrated on numerous occasions throughout the late 1700s, early 1800s. There was even a bizarre experiment in 1804 delivering shocks to people who could then call out an assigned letter. I guess each person was assigned a letter. So if you gave a shock to the person whose letter B, he would shout B or whatever. Anyway, that's one way of doing it, right? But more seriously, of course, the idea of, well, okay, we can telegraph, we can send electronically some information, we can develop some sort of code for it. This all coalesced with Samuel Morse, of course, Morse code and the development of the telegraph, the first telegraph line and all of that, right? Well, the story's maybe written by the winners, shall we say, and Morse was the winner. So don't necessarily take his idea at face value. Oh, it was a flash of genius that occurred to me, and then I worked hard and I made it happen. Again, I will refer back to Tom Wheeler, from Gutenberg to Google. He has a great encapsulation of this story. Basically, in 1830s-ish, Morse was on a long sea journey, and he had the thought occurred to him, well, he was an artist, by the way, not an inventor, not someone involved with electronics or anything of that sort. He was an artist, but the idea occurred to him, well, if electricity can be sent through a circuit, then information can be sent through a circuit, or at least that's the version of the story he tells. But then he ended up borrowing from various inventors and people that he met along the way, and people who told him about this thing that exists and that thing that exists, and eventually scrabbled together the earliest telegraph. Morse didn't even develop the Morse code. He had an idea for how to translate what was coming through the wires into language, but it was his one of his assistants, Vail, Harry Vail. I can't remember the guy's name, but Vail essentially developed what we now know of as the Morse code. But you better believe Morse did patent it. So he definitely made the most of it. And he did send the first official telegraph from the Supreme Court in the Capitol building in Washington to Vail in Baltimore. It was the first official message sent over. I mean, obviously, there'd been many, many tests and things along the way, but this was the first time an official message was being sent. And trivia note, does anyone know what was the first message, the first official message sent through that telegraph line? The answer is, "What hath God wrought?" Yes. It seems Morse, when he was in Washington and doing the politics and making sure the line was in place and all of that, he was staying with someone, and he fell in love with that someone's daughter, his 18-year-old daughter. Morse was 53 at the time. And he allowed her to choose the message. And she, being a good, devout Christian, decided to use numbers 23:23. Surely there is no enchantment against Jacob, neither is there any divination against Israel. According to this time, it shall be said of Jacob and of Israel, what hath God wrought? Which in its context is an amazing, like, oh, God has done amazing things. What hath God wrought? It's beautiful. It's what hath God wrought? Exclamation mark. So what hath God wrought became the first telegraph that was ever sent. But when it was reported on, the question became, well, there was no punctuation at the end of that. Is that a what hath God wrought, or is that a what hath God wrought? Which, again, Wheeler writes about in From Gutenberg to Google. Over the years, there's been much confusion about the punctuation of the first telegraph message. The message was commonly believed to be an interrogatory statement that closed with a question mark. That, however, is not how the phrase appears in Scripture. In Numbers, the phrase closes a passage of exultation about Jacob and Israel with an exclamation point. Morse transmitted the message without punctuation as "What hath God wrought?" After the message was transmitted, it was transcribed, at which time a question mark was added, even though one was not transmitted. It might seem like a little bit of trivia, but actually I think this speaks to an important point. Because, of course, telegraphs were immediately put to the use of conveying not just information, but news, important news, right? So the question of how do you render language in this new Morse code and then send it through the wires, and you got to pay for each letter, you're going to have to shorten it up and find different ways of encoding this information, and what gets left out, and ultimately then what interpretations have to be done with that information. It presents an actual real question about what message this media is designed to send. A little foreshadowing for someone we'll be talking about later. Anyway, all right, so what is the news? 1800s edition. We get the rise, of course, after the telegraph, we get the rise of these news agencies. And again, this is not something that was written in the stars. This is not something that was always there or always meant to be. It's, okay, people looked at that and looked at the development of telegraphy and thought, okay, now we can transport large volumes of information across large distances. Well, how do we use this to our advantage? And so, of course, they set about commoditizing the idea of international news. So the first one to really take advantage of this was Agence Havas. It was headed by someone named Havas. I forget his first name at the moment, but Agence Havas eventually became AFP, Agence France Presse, which obviously still continues to this day. And you'll still, if you note when you're reading a news article, sometimes you'll see via AFP or Agence France Presse or something like that at the top. And Agence Havas pioneered the collection and dissemination of news as a commodity. So their idea is, we'll take news. Look, we've got agents in Paris and London and Berlin, whatever, and they're all connected by telegraph. We can collect the news from Paris and send it to London instantaneously, essentially, at the speed of light. And we can get the information there so they can publish it in their newspapers. We'll make that our business. And we will collect this information. We'll write the little report. We'll send it over to them and they'll publish it in their newspapers. So people will subscribe to them. It's a business model now, sending information as news. And of course, since it was a profitable business, other people jumped into it fairly quickly. One example is that Agence Havas had some employees, one named Paul Julius Reuter. Another was named Bernard Wolff. Reuter was in London. Wolff was in Berlin. And they both went and formed their own competitive agencies. I don't know if Wolff still exists or what form it still does, but obviously Reuters still exists, and to this very day. Also along those lines, the AP, the Associated Press, which started out as the New York Associated Press, telegraphic agency, was founded in 1846 by 5 different New York dailies that were trying to share the cost of reporting the Mexican-American War. Basically, of course, I mean, each newspaper, I guess, could send a correspondent or something like that, but that seems, oh no, we got this telegraph, we'll get someone over there to be our agent, and they'll send the news to us, and hey, we can do that in a lot of different places. Let's start this telegraphic agency. So that was the origins of it. And I will note, again, playing on the media conspiracy theme, there was a conspiracy of sorts, an investigation in 1892 by Victor Lawson, who was the editor and publisher of the Chicago Daily News, revealed that several principals of the NYAP, the New York Associated Press, had entered into a secret agreement with United Press, a rival organization, to share NYAP news and the profits of reselling, which was a big scandal at the time, and I think eventually resulted in the dropping of NYAP and it became AP. But anyway, as you know, AP is still around to this day, and still the same idea. They're collecting information at these various parts, and then they're homogenizing it and sending it out, and people will publish that, sometimes word for word, sometimes they might add to that reporting. But the idea is it's a centralized, decentralized activity, if that makes sense. There is a central organization that is collecting from many different nodes on this network and then sending it out to others who subscribe to them. So then the question of what hath God wrought, exclamation mark or question mark, becomes, as I say, a real thing in the age of telegraphy news, because suddenly we have to send a lot of information through these wires that are extremely expensive. I believe AP likes to brag that they covered the first national election that was held on a single day in the United States. I believe the 1848 election, I'd stand to be corrected, but they covered it to great expense. I think it cost something like $1,000 in order to collect all of the results from all these different places and report on it the next day, presumably. And $1,000 back in 1848 was a lot of money. But again, this actually speaks to the fact that with each iteration of the technological development in the development of mass media, it's more and more capital intensive. Fewer and fewer people are going to have access to it. Back in the 1700s, it might have been easier for the average person to get access to the press, and we saw the large proliferation of pamphlets of various sorts that obviously had a huge effect on the American Revolution, for example. As I've pointed out earlier this year or last year, I wrote an editorial that was talking about Thomas Paine and the incredible significance and importance of common sense in the fostering of the American Revolution, because it was a widely literate society, and the access to the press was such that someone who was not incredibly rich could publish a pamphlet that could catch on and essentially get distributed all over the fledgling United States of America, or whatever it was calling itself at the time. So what does the Telegraph look like? Well, this is from chapter 5 of Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann, not Walter Williams. The unseen environment is reported to us chiefly by words. These words are transmitted by wire or radio from the reporters to the editors who fit them into print. Obviously, Lippmann writing in this instance in 1922. Telegraphy is expensive and the facilities are often limited. Press service news is therefore usually coded. Thus, a dispatch which reads, Washington, D.C., June 1st, the United States regards the question of German shipping seized in this country at the outbreak of hostilities as a closed incident, may pass over the wires in the following form. Washington 1, the United States regards Tukov, blah, blah, blah. I mean, essentially, it's almost like its own language, right? And that, I think, just speaks to, that's the most literal and obvious way in which the language itself starts to shape itself around the media. But then, then there's all the sort of second and third order questions about the way that reading something that's sent by someone you don't know from another part of the world that you don't know, how is that information encapsulated and how is it understood by you? There are some deep questions that I think Lippmann did get into in some interesting detail in Public Opinion, more on which later. But I think the accumulation of technologies, including the telegraph and the rotary press and other things, and the wire services, gave rise to widespread daily newspaper circulation, and ultimately then the battle for customers of those newspapers, and that intensified throughout the 19th century, and resulted in essentially, I think, a new era, the era of the media moguls or the press barons or whatever you want to say. As I say, it's getting more and more expensive, more and more out of the reach of the average person, that you can't necessarily just go to the presses and print your latest pamphlet and have it catch on widely. Now it's becoming a more capital intensive process. So generally speaking, I think you'll find when you start to look at the histories of a lot of these moguls, when you search back in their history, generally they inherited a newspaper or a radio station or what have you from their rich parents, but parlayed that into a empire, essentially, which started to arise specifically, I think, in the late 19th century and continuing into the 20th century, having a huge effect. These individuals were able, to a large extent, to steer the editorial policies of their newspapers and ultimately their radio stations and TV stations as we move on in the era, in ways that I don't think were possible for individuals, certainly not pre-Gutenberg. The idea of a single person thousands of miles away from you being able to control the minds of millions of people would have been absolutely outlandish pre-printing press. And even at post-printing press, before the telegraph, before the invention of the rotary press, before all of these inventions, it would have been extremely difficult. So we get the rise of moguls like William Randolph Hearst. Wrong picture. William Randolph Hearst, of course. And you all know Hearst. At the very least, you've probably seen Citizen Kane, so you have some idea of the fictionalization of that story. But William Randolph Hearst inherited the San Francisco Examiner from his wealthy father at the ripe young age of 24. He ended up moving to New York and purchasing the New York Journal. And from that point, he began a publication war with Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. And this is the part of the story that I find interesting. So this results in what we now refer to as yellow journalism. And the history of that term, yellow journalism, why yellow journalism? In Pulitzer's New York, I went way too far there. In Pulitzer's New York World, we had, there was a cartoon called Hogan's Alley, which featured prominently this creepy looking kid dressed in this yellow nightshirt. And he generally had some sort of bizarre slogan scrawled on the nightshirt. And it was meant to, parody, satirize, immortalize the kind of weird slang you'd hear in the ghettos in New York in the late 19th century. I don't know. I don't get it, but I can only imagine someone 100 years from now giving a presentation about the types of memes that are spread online these days and trying to describe. So you see, Nicolas Cage was this actor who sometimes one could imagine that would be a similarly bizarre endeavor. Anyway, the yellow kid became this phenomenon. It was an important part of the New York World. And when it started to catch on, Hearst bought the illustrator away from Pulitzer and put him to work for the New York Journal. And so essentially the yellow kid followed him over to his paper. And that's where the term yellow journalism comes from. Now, on the right side of the screen here, you see the New York Journal from 1898, right? The destruction of the Maine, of course, right? And just looking at the layout of that newspaper, it is something that I think we would understand as a newspaper layout, right? But not necessarily people from earlier in the 19th century. That in and of itself was an invention, as it were, and often credited to the yellow journalists, Pulitzer and Hearst and others that were engaged in their circulation battle. They started to make headlines bolder and bigger and more sensationalist. They started to use illustrations and colorful and interesting layouts and things to grab readers' attention immediately. And, as is often alleged, to dumb down the news. And so that is the legacy of William Randolph Hearst that he's best known for. In fact, he's probably best known for the immortal quote, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war," which he said to a reporter who got to Cuba and said, "Well, there's nothing happening here." And he said, "Oh, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." And he did. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. We have to get those damn Spaniards. He loudly proclaimed from the front page of the New York Journal that it was Spain and we got to go after them, and roused up his readers out of genuine belief and patriotism, or out of a cynical ploy to get readership. Well, I don't know. At any rate, did he actually say, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war"? As I said before, like pretty much every quote, that one's probably apocryphal. Again, I'll throw a link in the course notes if you're interested in hunting that down. But anyway, at any rate, this was the result. And it is now fashionable to say that yellow journalism and its role in ramping up, say, the Spanish-American War and other things has been overblown. And it wasn't actually. That's what scholars like to do after a century of basically consensus. They like to come along and say, well, actually, you're all wrong. But certainly, I think palpably, it did gin up some war sentiment in the public, certainly in New York, and as a knock-on effect in other parts of the United States. And ultimately, in fact, this reached across the pond, as we'll see in a moment. But let's look at some other people. Adolph Ochs, who is maybe not a name that you would recognize immediately, unless you're into such things, but you might recognize the name Sulzberger, because Sulzberger, there is someone by the name of Sulzberger who is the current publisher of the New York Times. There has been a person by the name of Sulzberger at the helm of the New York Times for a lot of the past century, and that's because it relates back to Adolph Ochs, who took over the New York Times in 1896 and then passed down the publishership of that paper through the generations. first to his son-in-law, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, then to the husband of his granddaughter, Orville Dreyfus. Dreyfus? It's spelt two O's. And then to Ock's grandson, Arthur Ock Sulzberger, and then to his great-grandson, Arthur Ock Sulzberger Jr., and to his great-great-grandson, the current publisher of the New York Times, Arthur Gregg A.G. Sulzberger. So it has been a family affair for a very, very long time, and I don't think I need to elaborate for anyone who's in my regular audience the lies, omissions, and various scandals that the New York Times has been involved in, certainly in recent history, but go back throughout history and you will find many, many examples of that. In fact, one of the books that I will recommend later, it's called The Gray Lady Winked by Ashley Rinsberg. Don't worry, I will have that on my recommended reading list, so you can go check it out. I have my reservations about certain parts of this book, but at any rate, it does give a pretty good overview of some of the things the New York Times has been involved with over the years, covering up Stalin and Stalin's starving of his population and other such things, active complicity in the Hiroshima bombing, etc. So yeah, the New York Times. What else needs to be said? Let's go, again, this is not an American phenomenon. This was happening all over the world. For example, who knows this person by face? Probably not that many people today, but this is Alfred Harmsworth, First Lord Northcliffe. So this, Alfred was born to a well-to-do family, but not a particularly central to the power structure family. He was born in Ireland. His father was a British barrister. His mother was Irish matriarch, whatever that means. That's the way she's described. So he grew up well-to-do, and he was educated in England. In fact, here's your little trivia tidbit for today. He went to Henley House School, a boarding school, presumably, in England, which was attended by A.A. Milne, who, of course, you will know, is the author of Winnie the Pooh. And it was A.A. Milne's father, who was J.V. Milne, who was a master at the school, who was apparently the one who encouraged Alfred Harmsworth, as he was then known, before he became Lord Northcliffe, to start the school newspaper. So in a way, somehow you can kind of mix that together and say we have Winnie the Pooh to blame for the Daily Mail. Because, of course, as you may or may not know, Alfred Harmsworth made it, well, he started publishing cheap but very popular periodicals and started amassing some money that way, which he parlayed into purchasing failing newspapers and then applying the lessons of yellow journalism. And, okay, I can make it sensationalistic and widely increase the circulation. And that's exactly what he set about doing. First, he purchased the Evening News, the Daily Mail, the Daily Mirror. Eventually, he got the Times and the Sunday Times. So he had a vast, incredible newspaper publishing empire that had a very large sway over the public of England in a very important time in English history, which you will know if you have watched the World War I conspiracy, corbettreport.com/WWI. Absolutely, the English press, and Lord Northcliffe among them, was extremely important in that. So just as an indication of that, one of his rival papers, The Star, wrote that next to the Kaiser, Lord Northcliffe has done more than any living man to bring about the war, World War I. And if you need more indications of that, I would recommend, of course, Hidden History, which was one of the key sources for my work on World War I conspiracy. Also, Prolonging the Agony has a lot more information about Northcliffe and his machinations. But let me see. I think I have something marked here. So in Hidden History, The Secret Origins of the First World War by Jerry Docherty and Jim McGregor, they just note that the revolution in newspaper circulation with its popular daily papers, magazines, and pamphlets bypassed the Times in the first years, as in the London Times. People in the UK hate it when I say London Times. It's just the Times, but it kind of gets confused with other Times, okay? The Times, in the first years of the 20th century, but did not alter its focus. The paper was, however, ailing and in danger of running an unsustainable loss. Its savior, Alfred Harmsworth, was on first consideration an unlikely guardian of the secret elite's public voice. As leader of the Yellow Press, a term of utter contempt derived from the sensationalist journalism developed in New York at the turn of the century, Harmsworth did not naturally belong inside the elite, but as his extensive stable proved, sensationalism sold newspapers and they wielded immense influence. He bought up a very large section of the London-based press, including the Daily Mail, the Daily Mirror, the Daily Graphic, Evening News, and Weekly Dispatch. If he was not from the natural constituencies that bred Britain's elite, he was close to them. And it goes on to say that ultimately he got drawn closer and closer into that secret elite that they write about here in this book. Northcliffe was the secret elite's chosen man. His loyalty to the Empire, Milner, and the king shone through. He was a valuable contributor in their drive to vilify the Kaiser, and his papers constantly repeated the warning that Germany was the enemy. So he had a large role in shaping early 20th century history, ultimately, through his wielding of that press power. All right, moving on. So those are okay. So we've looked at some moguls, but let's move into what is becoming the next era, the next era of media history, which is beyond the media moguls and press barons, the individuals who are able to wield such power. It starts to become more corporatized, and we start to see that in the Morgan conspiracy. What is the Morgan conspiracy? Well, as Gary Allen notes in None Dare Call It Conspiracy, as soon as Woodrow Wilson's reelection had been engineered through the He Kept Us Out of War slogan in 1916, as you'll know again from World War I conspiracy, a complete reversal of propaganda was instituted. In those days before radio and television, public opinion was controlled almost exclusively by newspapers. Many of the major newspapers were controlled by the Federal Reserve crowd. Now they began beating the drums over the inevitability of war. Arthur Ponsonby, a member of the British Parliament, admitted in his book Falsehood in Wartime, there must have been more deliberate lying in the world from 1914 to 1918 than in any other period of the world's history. We might be giving that period a run for its money, but at any rate, yes, a lot of, in fact, even the word propaganda, the concept of it, how we understand that word, sources largely from World War I and what happened in terms of information control that was very consciously wielded by the powers that shouldn't be, through not only engineering that conflict, but then obviously how the conflict played out. And that's something that, again, if you did read Public Opinion or parts thereof, you will have noticed that that was an important theme of a lot of what Lippmann was responding to at that time, talking about the ways that news, for say, of the war was transmitted to others at that time through the newspapers, because that was the media at the time. Everyone got their information about what was happening in the world through the newspapers. So it was an extremely important thing to have control of the printing press. And what was this that Gary Allen was saying about the Federal Reserve crowd? Well, we don't have to take Gary Allen's word for it. Let's go back to the congressional record, February 9th, 1917, in which we have this interesting speech from Mr. Calloway. In March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interests, the steel, shipbuilding, and powder interests, and their subsidiary organizations got together 12 men high up in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States and sufficient number of them to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. These 12 men worked the problem out by selecting 179 newspapers and then began, by an elimination process, to retain only those necessary for the purpose of controlling the general policy of the daily press throughout the country. They found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. The 25 papers were agreed upon. Emissaries were sent to purchase the policy, national and international, of these papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought, to be paid for by the month, and an editor was furnished for each paper to properly supervise and edit information regarding the questions of preparedness, militarism, financial policies, and other things of national and international nature considered vital to the interests of the purchasers. This contract is in existence at the present time, and it accounts for the news columns of the daily press of the country being filled with all sorts of preparedness arguments and misrepresentations as to the present condition of the United States Army and Navy, and the possibility and probability of the United States being attacked by foreign foes. This policy also included the suppression of everything in opposition to the wishes of the interests served. The effectiveness of this scheme has been conclusively demonstrated by the character of stuff carried in the daily press throughout the country since March 1915. They have resorted to anything necessary to commercialize public sentiment and sandbag the National Congress into making extravagant and wasteful preparations for the Army and Navy under the false pretense that it was necessary. Their stock argument is that it is patriotism. They are playing on every prejudice and passion of the American people. War propaganda. And according to this, which again is coming from the Congressional Record, this is a speech by Mr. Callaway, who's a congressman at the time, in the context of a discussion about munitions and profits that were being made on this coming war and why the U.S. seemed to be being steered into the Great War. And this came up, and it is introduced, Mr. Chairman, under unanimous consent, I insert in the record at this point a statement showing the newspaper combination, which explains their activity in the war matter just discussed by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. So I don't know, what is the nature of this statement, and where is he getting it from, and where did it, how did he source this? And it's comforting in its specifics. March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interests, 12 men selecting 179 newspapers. They decided 25 papers were agreed upon, and emissaries were sent out. Okay, which papers, and who are the 12 men, and how do we know this information, and where did this all come from? I'm not exactly sure on the details of where this ultimately came from. I could very much imagine something like this happened. But at any rate, I think we should take it seriously, the idea that there is conglomerations of people in real positions of power who have, at the very least, vested financial interests in specific political outcomes, who would go to such lengths, such incredible lengths, to control the interests of various newspapers, right? So I think that's an interesting part of the media conspiracy, and perhaps the inevitable playing out of the printing press revolution, which was a type of conspiracy, towards the Morgan conspiracy. I think there's a line of historical continuity there. But let's move on, and let's just look at some critics of the age, people who had important things to say about what was going on in terms of media, mass media, during this era specifically, the era of newspapers and print media being the primary form of mass communication. And again, you may or may not have seen, I did put on a recommended reading list Walter Lippmann, Public Opinion. Again, I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier, separating the person or preconceptions from what they actually wrote. For years and years, my only understanding of Lippmann came through Chomsky, who would occasionally refer to Lippmann as the man who coined the term manufacturing consent and was lumped in with Bernays. He's this propagandist who wants to control the masses and what they're thinking through the press and things like this. I would hope, if you have read this, or at least parts of it, certainly the section on newspapers, I would hope that you come to the understanding this is actually a very thoughtful and very interesting critique of the media as it stood in the early 20th century. I certainly do not agree with all of the proscriptive ideas of what Lippmann thinks should be done or how it should be done, but he is an insightful critic of what was happening at the time with regards to media. And I don't know if Thad would agree with me on this, but maybe interesting pre-postmodernist in some ways. At the very least, he talks in great detail about the social construction of things that we consider to be facts and truth, and where does this knowledge come from anyway, and how do we know what we know, and those sorts of things. I think there's some really interesting philosophical ideas in here, and some insightful analysis. Just sort of the general background, Lippmann has been considered the journalist of his age, perhaps the most influential journalist in America, if not the world, in the time period he was writing. He was born in late 19th century. He died, I think, in the 1970s, but he was active for a large portion of the first half of the American century and was very influential in his day. Public Opinion specifically has been called the founding text of media criticism in America, at any rate. So it's an important thing to have on your bookshelf, I would say, just generally. But as I say, he has some real moments of insight that I think apply even to us today in our current media environment. He points out, for example, that in that era of newspaper and the battle for newspaper circulation and all of that, he said the readers of a newspaper, unaccustomed to paying the cost of news gathering, can be capitalized only by turning them into circulation that can be sold to manufacturers and merchants. Where have we heard that idea before? Of course, that's what everyone says. If you're, how does that saying go? You're the product. If you're not paying for the service, you're the product. Whatever that people always say with regards to the social media companies of today. Well, Lippmann was pointing that out a century ago. And those whom it is most important to capitalize are those who have the most money to spend. Such a press is bound to respect the point of view of the buying public. See, Lippmann takes us in an interesting direction, because a lot of the media critics would say, oh yeah, they're battling for circulation so that they can sell to advertisers so that they won't look into what the advertisers are doing. Lippmann points out at some point, well, this isn't about covering up the conspiracies of the dry goods retailers or something like that. No, there's a deeper thing that's happening here. Such a press is bound to respect the point of view of the buying public. It is for this buying public that newspapers are edited and published, for without that support, the newspaper cannot live. A newspaper can flout an advertiser, it can attack a powerful banking or traction interest, but if it alienates the buying public, it loses the one indispensable asset of its existence. So what does that mean? How does that play out in terms of the formation of its policy? It says Lippmann says a newspaper that can really depend upon the loyalty of its readers is as independent as a newspaper can be, given the economics of modern journalism. But his point was no newspaper can really count on that. So there is no independent newspaper. And he goes on to make the point that about the nature of news, chapter 23 of Public Opinion. Fascinating stuff. And he makes a really important point. The point is that before a series of events become news, what is the news? Before a series of events become news, they have usually to make themselves noticeable in some more or less overt act. Generally, in a crudely overt act. Something definite must occur that has unmistakable form. It may be the act of going into bankruptcy. It may be a fire, a collision, an assault, a riot, an arrest, a denunciation, the introduction of a bill, a speech, a vote, a meeting, the expressed opinion of a well-known citizen, an editorial in a newspaper, a sale, a wage schedule, a price change, the proposal to build a bridge. You know, when you think about it, a lot of the same things that are in the London Gazette, the Oxford Gazette, the first English newspaper, or the longest continuously published English newspaper, which, as we saw, publishes what? The news? Well, it publishes a lot of things about, royal assent to a bill or commissions that are being given or things like that, as in identifiable facts about the world. Well, that's what Lippmann is gesturing towards here, that ultimately what we consider to be the news are the identifiable points at which a story, which has been developing and percolating and may have all sorts of antecedents and consequences, it comes to the surface as a news story when a particular event happens, an identifiable, quantifiable event. And at that moment, it becomes news. And so what does that mean about the nature of news reporting? And how do we steer a society based on these news reports, which themselves are only noting the certain points at which certain events emerge to the surface, as it were? Again, I don't agree with all of his prescriptive ideas, but he has a lot of interesting insights. Also, in another book he published called Liberty and the News, which is a collection of a couple or a few different essays he published in various places, that he made some interesting insight about what was going on. He said, now the popular theory of representative government is that the representatives have the information and therefore create the policy with the executive administrators. The more subtle theory is that the executive initiates the policy, which the legislature corrects in accordance with popular wisdom. But when the legislature is haphazardly informed, this amounts to very little, and the people themselves prefer to trust the executive, which knows, rather than the Congress, which is vainly trying to know. The result has been the development of a kind of government which has been harshly described as plebiscite autocracy, or government by newspapers. Decisions in the modern state tend to be made by the interaction, not of Congress and the executive, but of public opinion and the executive. Public opinion and the executive. Public opinion for this purpose finds itself collected about special groups which act as extra-legal organs of government. There is a labor nucleus, a farmers nucleus, a prohibition nucleus, a national security league nucleus, and so on. These groups conduct a continual electioneering campaign upon the unformed, exploitable mass of public opinion. And he goes on to talk about the way that that works. Government tends to operate by the impact of controlled opinion upon administration. This shift in the locus of sovereignty has placed a premium upon the manufacture of what is usually called consent. No wonder that the most powerful newspaper proprietor in the English-speaking world declined a mere government post. Now, I don't know about you, but that's actually, I tend to be in accord with what he's saying here. He is describing a reality that exists, and the most powerful newspaper proprietor in the English-speaking world would decline a mere government post as a demotion, right? I think that corresponds to a lot of what I talk about at the Corbett Report and what I've seen, the way power functions in society. That is the context in which this manufacture of consent is embedded. If I had only ever listened to Chomsky's characterization of Lippmann, I would not have read Lippmann and discovered, oh, he actually has some insightful things to say. And in the end, he goes on to say, in this view, liberty is the name we give to measures by which we protect and increase the veracity of the information upon which we act. I'll read that again. Liberty is the name we give to measures by which we protect and increase the veracity of the information upon which we act, which is an interesting formulation. That goes back to something I was talking about earlier, the tension between positive liberty and negative liberty. Negative liberty, I'm free from government intervention. The government cannot step in and do something. This is obviously the Bill of Rights. The government shall not, cannot, will make no law, does not intervene. But positive liberty is the flip side of that. What he's saying here, the preservation of the information that we, and the veracity, ensuring the veracity of the information that we use, well, that implies some sort of positive obligation on the part of government, does it not? Again, I disagree with some of his pronouncements, but I think his insights into the problem were quite interesting and probably worth your attention if you're interested in this. Let's turn to another critic of the age, the Hutchins Commission, which I mentioned earlier, their final report, Free and Responsible. Oh, let's not jump the gun there, James. Come on. And that's how we end. All right, done. The Hutchins Commission ran from it was formed in 1942. It delivered its final report in 1947. It met a number of times. The actual names of the people involved in this commission, which I should have lying around in a book, which for some reason is on the floor. Why not? An aristocracy of critics. Don't worry, this will be in the recommended reading list at the end, and it will be in the course notes, so you don't need to copy it down now. But an aristocracy of critics, Luce, Hutchins, Niebuhr, and the committee that redefined freedom of the press by Stephen Bates, which is a very, very recent, I believe 2021, book about the Hutchins Commission, which was headed up by Robert M. Hutchins, who was the chancellor of the University of Chicago. And Zechariah Chafee was the vice chairman. He was the professor of law at Harvard. And they were, Hutchins essentially was recruited by Henry Luce, who is not someone we looked at in that media Age of the Moguls slides, but that I did write about in my editorial a few weeks ago on the media moguls. I forget what the exact title of that was, but I did write about Luce, who is a name you should know. He was the founder, the co-founder of Time Inc. He was actually born in China to American missionary parents, and of course attended Yale, as you do, Skull and Bones, as you do, and started Time Inc. with a few of his Yale friends, and parlayed that into the Time Life empire that it became, obviously starting Time Magazine, Life Magazine, Fortune, House and Home, Sports Illustrated, and a bunch of other periodicals that to this day are still circulated. Anyway, I don't know about popular. And he was involved in other things, the March of Times, Newsreel, and other such things, and other things that we'll get into next lesson. But Henry Luce came to Hutchins in 1942, perhaps concerned about his legacy and what kind of legacy he could leave, and thought, we got to tackle this problem of freedom of the press. This is something that, keeps getting bandied about, and should there be censorship, and, what role does government play, and what should the public play, and how do we regulate newspapers and other such things? How do we ensure accurate information? So he turned to Hutchins, the chancellor of the University of Chicago, and said, put together a committee, I'll fund it, we'll put out a report, settle this thing once and for all, essentially. The story of that committee and the various people that were committed, that were roped into it, is fascinating. It's an interesting panel, actually. Reinhold Niebuhr, the professor of ethics and philosophy of religion, Union Theological Seminary, a name that's still quite popular. People will know. William Hawking of Harvard University, Arthur Schlesinger of Harvard, Archibald MacLeish, the former Assistant Secretary of State. Various other people were involved in the production in this committee. And they came out with that report that I referenced earlier, A Free and Responsible Press, which again, I'll put in the recommended reading, so it'll be there for you. An interesting document. And as Bates talks about the construction of that in the committee meetings and how they decided on what they were going to talk about and how they were going to present it, it was interesting because there was definitely that tension between such things as positive liberty versus negative liberty. And you had a couple of committee members strongly saying, no, the meaning of the First Amendment and what it means that government, will allow free speech is that the government will allow, not just allow, will actually make sure to enforce access to the press of the people. Well, how do you do that? I mean, the government's going to have to step in and actively, make sure that the people have direct access to the press. He would never come out and say exactly what he meant by that. They had other people on the other side of the coin. You had people involved in tangential ways with the industry itself saying, no, we don't want to regulate. So it was an interesting committee, which resulted in this bizarre document that Hutchins was not happy with it. Luce was definitely not happy with it because he ultimately got excluded from the meetings over the years. He had basically nothing to do with it. And at the end, he pretty much disclaimed it and disowned it. But for some reason, despite the fact that it comes out and basically says nothing. It says that the newspapers should regulate themselves and they should adhere to the truth and they should do this and they should do that. But it doesn't really say how, or it makes it explicit. There has to be some sort of government censorship or something. But it does talk in very general terms about the nature of freedom of the press and what that means and other such things. And it is now, the Freedom and Responsible Press is now hailed as a landmark, a touchstone in media criticism, the concept of freedom of the press in America, in the American context. It's still talked about and written about to this day. So it's something worth noting and knowing about. At least give it a glance through. It's on archive.org, so you don't have to buy the book or anything. All right, having said all of that, I think the point is that by the time we got to certainly World War I, we're talking about the zenith of that print revolution that was set in motion by the Gutenberg conspiracy 500 plus years prior. 400 plus years prior. My math isn't good today. So it took about 450 years, I think, for the movable type printing press revolution to really play out in its entirety. And now we have newspapers that are controlling so much of people's minds and attention, and everyone's getting their news about the world from these agencies that are collecting and transmitting them across telegraphic wires, and they're being published and printed and distributed out. And so I think of this as the zenith of print, i.e. it's the absolute, it's the height, it's the most pervasive moment in human history where the ability of someone in a particular office, not just anyone, but someone in with access to the printing press to be able to get that message out to millions of people in a way that never before would have been possible. But as it implies, the zenith of print means that after that point, it starts to decrease, right? So the question is, where does it go? And we'll answer that in a second. But actually, I'll just note this image in particular speaks to so much of what we're talking about today, because this image is of an image that I believe was taken on November 7th, 1918, which you might find odd because, wait, the armistice that ended World War I, German surrender, wasn't actually signed until November 11th, right? Well, apparently, and I didn't know about this till I started researching for this presentation, but apparently there was a fake report that went out that the war was over, armistice signed, it's done, Germany surrendered, it's, yay. And it got published all over the newspapers, and there were celebrations all over the United States. War is over, Germany surrenders. Turns out it was fake news. I mean, it did happen 4 or 5 days later, but there was that gap in which people were celebrating the end of a war that had not actually ended. And that, in fact, if you did read Public Opinion, you'll note that Lippmann makes mention of that in one of the early chapters. He talks about that moment where people are celebrating the end of a war that is actually still ongoing. Anyway, it's just an interesting thing to think about when we talk about the the incredible power of media over our minds. The media shapes our understanding of the world and what we think is happening in the world. But if this is the zenith of print, what comes next? Of course, the next technological development, the radio revolution. And it is on that note that we will leave you on the cliffhanger for today, to be continued in our lesson next week. But before we get into that, I just wanted to put up the recommended reading. These are some of the texts that I talked about today, and some that I didn't talk about today. The Areopagitica by John Milton, obviously available on Gutenberg.org. Right? How interesting. Liberty in the News by Walter Lippmann, Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann, Free and Responsible Press by the Hutchins Commission, An Aristocracy of Critics by Stephen Bates, The Grey Lady Winked by Ashley Ridsberg, The Tyranny of Words by Stuart Chase. That was a book I talked about in episode 357 of the Corbett Report on the tyranny of language as a weapon, I believe was the name of that episode. And Stuart Chase had some interesting things to say about the way language could and was used by newspapers and others to influence people's perception of the world. And From Gutenberg to Google by Tom Wheeler. Again, I hope you can find a way to borrow it from your library. Don't give him money, but it has a lot of good information about certainly the earlier parts about Gutenberg and the train lines and telegraphs and that sort of development. Other than that, I would also say, and let me stop sharing the screen so you can actually see me. I would also say so again, you don't have to read anything for this course, but if you are interested, I would say it's highly worth your time to read Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media, or at least some of the interesting chapters, whatever catches your fancy, because there's a lot in there. And next time we're going to be talking about understanding media, about manufacturing consent, Berman and Chomsky, Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, and The Invasion from Mars by Hadley Cantrell. We got some interesting stuff to talk about next lesson. I will just tease you by saying the next lesson, I haven't decided definitively, but I believe it's entitled TV as a Weapon. But we'll get into that. Obviously, we're going to get into the next revolution and how that affects everything. I think that's it. 2 hours, right? Oh my God, that's a lot of information. So as I say, all of the notes, all of the things that I cited will be in the course notes, and the recommended reading with links to the free versions, if they exist, of all of those books will be there. corbettreport.com/massmedia. Hey guys. So, how was that? Well, if you are still here after 2 hours of that lecture, I'm going to assume that you are one of the few, the proud, the dedicated people who actually care about the subject and who would sit through a 2-hour lecture on mass media. I'm sure we've lost some significant portion of the audience, but those of you who are still here, you are the dedicated researchers in the crowd, and you are the exact kind of people that I want in my online virtual classroom. So, if you are so inclined, you have just seen the first lesson of this 3-lesson course. And as I say, if you go to newworldnextweek.com, you can get the full course, which will include the download of not just the lessons themselves, the video of those 3 lessons, but also the transcript of these lessons and the study guide, which includes questions for further study and recommended reading. And as I say, the transcript has the hyperlinks to all of the information, all of the various things that I've cited. So a lot of information there, and I think it is worth your time and attention. It's available at New World Next Week. The entire course is available at New World Next Week. It's $50, but as always, Corbett Report members, if you are a paying member of the Corbett Report, you can use your subscriber discount code to get 25% off. And if you don't know about the discount code, it is at the bottom of every single edition of the Corbett Report newsletter. And if you have no idea what any of that means, well, then just email me. I'll be happy to go through it with you. Having said all of that, a lot of information here. You will probably, hopefully, recognize that the Media Matrix documentary that I released a while ago at corbettreport.com/media is, of course, an encapsulation of this research. And so part 1 of the Media Matrix on the Gutenberg conspiracy draws from lesson 1, the media conspiracy, part 2, part 3, etc. But if you really want to get into it, I suggest the online course is the way to go. 5.5 hours of lectures It'll keep you occupied until I'm back. As I say, I'm on my August hiatus. I am not posting anything more to the website in August. I'm working on other things busily behind the scenes, but I will be back in September with regular updates, New World Next Week, all that good stuff. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, enjoy your summer sunny holiday at the beach. Enjoy, playing with the kids. Enjoy studying, maybe. Anyway, hope to see you in the classroom. That's going to do it for today. James Corbett, corbettreport.com.